So this is the beginning of our program on the Dhammapada, and this evening Antonia and I are sharing this first offering in this program. If I can give you a little bit of a sense of how we're going to, operate it. Because we're not going to have time to do breakout groups, what we're hoping to do is to teach for a bit, to reflect on the text for a bit, and then to have several pause moments, a number of pause moments during the evening where we would really invite any questions, any reflections that you would like to bring forward. At 7:15, we'll have just a very short break for you to have a stretch, do what you need to do. To know when we come to the question times or the pause moments, we're going to operate by the raised hand system. So hopefully all of you know how to do that. If you have any trouble, you can just send a chat message to Marianne and she'll be able to help you with that. Okay, so shall we begin by just taking a moment to sit together quietly, just to gather ourselves, to arrive, to settle into the body, into this moment, however it is. Thank you all. So we have these evenings over the next weeks to reflect on this text, the Dhammapada, which I suspect that many of you are familiar with. For me, it's a delight to teach on this text. It's one that I keep very close to hand. It's one that has enormous meaning to me. It's a text that I find so inspiring in a way so very different from many of the other texts. And then the Dhammapada is one of the most read and most loved of the Buddhist texts. The way in poetic verse form that the core teachings of the Buddha are captured in a language that we can all relate to. And I do feel it's really worth taking time to reflect on each verse, to appreciate its profundity and also the implications for our lives. The verses in the Dhammapada really describe a personal and a universal landscape of our inner world. But the teachings in the Dhammapada also offer such clear and unambiguous guidance on how to live a life imbued with integrity, with kindness, with joy, and with wisdom. The message, I think, one of the central messages that comes through in the Dhammapada is the offering of both a path and a very real possibility of profound happiness and peace and liberation. There are over 50 translations of the Dhammapada. We're choosing mostly to focus on the translation by Bill Fonsdale, not in any way to be dismissive in any way at all of the other translations, but it's one that speaks to me quite clearly. As we reflect on these teachings, I think we can appreciate that really they are as relevant and true now as they were 2,500 years ago. This is speaking about human beings of any time, of any culture, of any background. It's speaking to human hearts and longings and aspirations. And as we go through this program, I would truly encourage you to take these teachings into your lives as practices and as reflections in the weeks between our sessions. This is a path. It's a path. There are many pathways offered in the Buddhist teaching, but this text really describes a path. And as we perhaps take these reflections into our lives as practices, to appreciate their challenges, because this is truly not easy. This is talking about a radical transformation of heart. But I think what is really inspiring and motivating is that to see that when we actually really practice these teachings, when we apply them to our lives, we do begin to taste the benefits. We really begin to taste the benefits, the peace, the joy, born of embodying these understandings. And as we begin this program, the last thing I'd like to say in this opening, before we get into the text and before Antonia speaks, is I think it's so important to remember that insight is not something we have. That insight is something that we cultivate and that we practice. So Antonia.
Thank you so much, Christina. And just really my heart is singing as I'm looking at the screen and just seeing every one of you. And just thank you so much, Christina, for inviting me to be part of this session. The text, really, the Dhammapada, is something that's also really close to my heart. I got a copy from one of my teachers many years ago. And, just seeing you and recognizing that some of you have written where you're coming from. I'm in Denmark, and I can see that we're coming in from many corners of the world. I really is reminded of that this is very much the spirit of this text also, that it's something that people have gathered around over generations, over centuries, but it's a text that's translated into so many different languages. The Danish version of this text has a drawing on the front of the Buddha by a Tibetan Lama. And that when I saw that, I was also reminded of how this is really a text that's a collection of verses of wisdom that's respected by practitioners and by all the different Buddhist traditions. So this is really something that's quite wonderful to gather around, connecting and reflecting. And I just have this image of how this is something that has been kept alive since the verses were collected, that it's not just something that has been found and then we are opening it for the first time, but it's really something that has been kept alive because people have been practicing with it. And many of you have been studying it, have been living your life with it. When we've been receiving Dharma teachings, talks, often there's been quotes from this. So this is something that's really alive, and now the time have come where we sit down together and we engaged in it, and I think that that's just a really wonderful opportunity to dive into something that's really timeless and discuss how does that resonate with us now, and what does that illuminate in our life, but also where may some of the challenges be, because there's also some of the verses that may be challenging for us in different ways. So as I very much look forward to this exploration.
Thank you, Antonia. So Antonia and I have chosen this evening to focus on sections 1 and 2, although most of our time is actually going to be given to section 1, because to me it's no surprise that this is the beginning or the embarkation point of the Dhammapada, because it is in truth such a profound teaching. But I would mention that you don't have to read the Dhammapada in sequential order. You know, you can dive into it different times of your life, different circumstances. One theme might be more appropriate to you than another. So this first section, sometimes it's titled The Pairs, and in Gil Fronsdal's book, it's titled Dichotomies. Now, what is being presented are two contrasting ways of seeing, living, and being. And you will see this right through the Dhammapada, this presentation of these two contrasting pathways that we can walk. And this first chapter speaks to this very directly. It speaks of one way of living and seeing and being in the world, which is guided by clarity, by kindness, by insight, and another way of living or being in the world, which is guided by confusion and distortion. Now, this can sound very simplistic, because we can often feel that we have a mixture of these things. You know, we have moments of confusion, moments of clarity. So it can sound quite simplistic in a way to almost offer these two pathways, or these two ways of being. And I think we just need to embrace that, you know, that it's not so straightforward in our lives, that it's always this or that. When these two ways of being are contrasted, this is not about good and bad. I think some of the primary questions that the Dhammapada addresses is the question of what supports us, what works, what undermines us, what doesn't work, what leads to greater peace and wakefulness, and what leads to feeling bound to repeated cycles of distress and struggle. I think this first section really raises really important questions for all of us about what we value, what we aspire to, what guides our life, our speech, our thoughts, our actions, and what do we want to embody. There's a wonderful quote from the Buddha, I think, which really supports this idea of practicing insight. When the Buddha said, wisdom arises from Dhamma practice. Without practice, it decays. Knowing this two-way path for gain and loss, conduct yourself so that wisdom grows. Do you want to add to that, Antonia, anything before we actually move on to the text?
No, I think that's beautiful. I think we can move on to the text.
Okay. So I'd like to read to you verses 1 and 2, because as we go through the text, we'll be kind of trying to unpack it as we go along, okay? So all experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted or impure mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows like a never departing shadow. These two verses I think, really capture in many ways what was radical about the Buddha's teaching. that moment to moment, our world of experience is being shaped. And it raises the question of, what is shaping our world of experience right now? Is it a mood or a mental state? Is our world of experience being shaped by fatigue or by brightness, by irritation or by gladness? Is our world of experience being shaped by a particular view that we hold? I know all of this. This is kindergarten stuff. Or is our world of experience being shaped by curiosity? Is our mind being shaped right now by one of the hindrance factors, by dullness, or by agitation, or by craving, or by aversion, or doubt? Or is our mind and our world of experience right now being shaped by one of the awakening factors, by mindfulness, by energy, by investigation, by joyfulness, by collectedness, by calm or equanimity? It's so important to bring this into this moment, into the mind of this moment, and our world of experience of this moment. And just as our mind or our heart is being shaped, our world of experience, the way that we see the world, the way that we experience life, the world right now, is also being shaped. We actually can't separate these two, the shaping of the mind and the shaping of the world. There's a quote I'm very fond of where it says that people think of the mind as something akin to a mirror, more or less accurately reflecting the world as it is, not appreciating that the mind is the principal architect of that world. What the Buddha is pointing out in these first two verses is that the shape or the shaping of our mind in any moment has outcomes. It has consequences. One of the outcomes can be a sense of greater distress. And another of the outcomes can be a sense of greater happiness. I think this we can track in our own experience. Speak or act with an impure or corrupt mind, and we'll go into a little bit what's meant by that. And distress and suffering will follow, just as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. What is a corrupt or corrupted or impure mind? And this is quite strong language, I think. It's not language we would kind of feel something that we could smile at. It's quite straightforward, direct language. I think what the Buddha is proposing, that when the mind is shaped and our seeing distorted by unskillful, unwholesome patterns of belief and reactivity, there will be distress. Greed, unwholesome, unskillful, but also simply doesn't work. Craving, unskillful, but also simply doesn't work. We can have temporary moments of relief through craving, but the underlying landscape of insufficiency means that craving is triggered and re-triggered. Hatred, ill will, we suffer. There is distress, others suffer. In Buddhist teaching, ill will or hatred is one of the primary manifestations of fear and anxiety, the fear of being hurt or injured. In the midst of that landscape of ill will, we judge, we blame, we shame, and hatred moves us to strike out or to flee and to abandon. And hatred seeks company. Ill will seeks company. It seeks allies, both inwardly and outwardly. Antonia, let's share.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I think that the beginning of this verse one, how all experiences is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. I really find that this is something to come back to again and again, and that this is something that is extremely nuanced. Of course, we may sort of see it on a more gross level when we wake up in the morning and we're a little bit grumpy and we go out on the street or in a bus and it just looks like everybody is a little bit grumpy. Or we wake up in the morning and we feel fresh and we're happy and we go out and all of a sudden everybody just look happy. So we may be able to detect it with practice and see how our experience really is colored by the mind, how it's the mind that's creating that experience. But I think that in my experience, actually, there are many other situations where I'm really surprised to the truth of this, and that it's of course our mood, but it's also really what we are actually able to see. So again and again, being confronted with this very ingrained idea that what we are seeing and what we are relating to is a world that we take in through the senses. And more starting to see, when we really take this to heart, we also start to see and we are reminded of how the world that we experience is something that's created. And earlier this summer, I had the opportunity to travel, and I traveled to a place where there was it was a volcanic island, and there was some wrecks, ships that have sunk. And I came in on the evening, so it was a little bit dark, but I could see something. But then the next day I went to a market, and all of a sudden there was a lot of people who were looking out at the sea, and they were very excited, and they were speaking loudly and moving and all kinds of things. And I was looking, and I couldn't see what they were so excited about. And it was a really interesting experience to stand and look at something and just know that there's something that I'm not able to see that these other people could see. And later I found out that there were actually a container ship that was sinking. But because I hadn't something to contrast it with, and because it was happening so really slowly, and it's not something that's part of my experience, I wasn't able to identify what was going on. But them, because they had different concepts and were able to see nuances that I was not attuned to, they could see what was going on. So this is something that is happening on a very literal way in our life, that what we experience, the world that we live in, is really a world that's created by our mind. It's a world that's created by our concepts. And we, as you were talking about also, Christina, we really start to see the difference between when our actions, our behaviors, and the kind of world that we are creating, but also how rapidly it often can shift. That it's not something that, for me at least, that is really something that's really stable at this point. But I think that there's something very, very promising in it. The opportunity that there is a happiness that we have access to, and that there is a happiness that can follow us like a shadow, something that is not gonna change and something that is not gonna wax and wane in our lives. So these two first verses, and it's really sort of the main, one of the key points in all the teachings about how we're working with our own perception, and what a mind that's not trained, how a mind that's not trained, that it cannot really utilize the power. We see how powerful the mind is, that it can create our world. And by training the mind, we also get to use that power in a positive way.
I'd like to reflect, thank you, Antonia, I'd like to reflect a little bit more about what is a peaceful mind. I'm sure we've all had glimpses of this, moments of this, perhaps less than we would like. In my understanding, a peaceful mind is something much more than a state. It is what a really lived understanding, a lived insight. I think so much of a peaceful mind really comes into being when we cease to argue with the unarguables, when we've ceased to argue with the realities of change, that we are vulnerable as human beings, that we've ceased to be involved in endlessly constructing a self or seeking for a permanent improved self, when we start to see that there's no self that has an independent existence. Because so much disquiet and struggle and agitation is really born of this argument. When we go through life, saying, well, this shouldn't be happening. It's not fair that we're waiting for a better moment. I think a peaceful mind is one that really lives in harmony with the way things actually are. And in the Buddhist teaching, the Buddha often describes liberation as the deepest peace, or the deepest happiness that never leaves us. The peaceful mind is so much, in my experience, so much cultivated through practice. If I thought that I could sit and wait for peace to suddenly strike me, I could wait for a very long time. I think it's really something born of practicing that which brings happiness, practicing that which brings peace. And, if we look at our own experience, we begin to see that there is much that brings peace. Moments of generosity have a taste of happiness. Moments of kindness have a taste of happiness and peace. Simplicity can have a great peacefulness to it. The cultivation of spaciousness can be deeply, deeply peaceful. And as Antonia has mentioned, the well-collected mind, the well-trained heart, this is a heart of peace. I think this is a good moment to just pause and to see if anyone has any questions so far.
We know the terror that people can live under and have inflicted upon them by natural situations. I have always found it difficult to come to terms with the idea that all experience is preceded by mind.
There's a couple of responses I would have. It would be going to a great extreme to imagine that the Buddha is saying that we are somehow endlessly creating all of the world. When the Buddha uses this word loka to describe the world, and he uses the word loka in two ways. One way, loka, or the world, is the world of conditions that we all live in. Some of them terrible, some of them lovely, 90% of which we don't control. And we are affected by that world of conditions. It would be, there would be no room for compassion or kindness or change or anything else unless we were able to be touched by that world of conditions. The second way that the Buddha uses the word loka is to speak of the inner world of experience. And he said, here, this is where we actually do have choices. We can't choose to have only the pleasant or conditions in our lives. We can't choose to avoid the unpleasant. But here in this inner world of experience, we have choices about how we're going to respond to that world of conditions that we live in the middle of. So I don't think it's being suggested that somehow, we're making this world of conditions. We're not. We live in the midst of it. But in the midst of that life, in the world of conditions, we bring our spectrum of responses, whether it's guided by confusion or whether it's guided by understanding. Antonia? Yeah.
I think that's good, Christina. Yeah.
Okay, do you want to take it? Was there someone else that had a question?
Both of you have talked about practice, the practice on the cushion and off the cushion. I know that one thing I do, I started to use the four immeasurables proactively when I was driving. It transformed not only my own way of driving, but also meant that I arrived happy and see that people were generous in their driving. Do you have any off-the-cushion advice for practicing this couplet?
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning that, because I think that is really what is important, isn't it? You know, these are wisdom teachings that are here to really transform our lives, and not just, you know, to be with us on the cushion or when we read them. And one thing that I've found really helpful with a text like this is just to go with the verses and repeat them from time to time. And now we're talking about the first, and we're talking about how our world of experience is created by the mind. And like we talked about before, to really reflect on this in our everyday life, and to look at the examples where we feel that this is something that's close to us, and when the examples where we feel that this is something that is very far from us, when we get caught in reactivity and so forth. But it's almost like these verses can be dropped into our mind and into our heart and stay with us throughout the day. And then it becomes like having a dialogue. And just like Luke was saying before, sometimes it may also be really helpful there where we have resistance or where we feel that there's something that's unclear, and to have that dialogue with this as we're bringing it into it. So it's more like analytic in that sense, but it can be analytic in a very experiential way, where it's really looking through our own experience and dropping some of these throughout the day.
I agree. I feel that whether we're lay people or whether we were monastics, most of our practice is off the cushion. It's not on the cushion. Unless we are engaging in a lifelong intensive meditation retreat, which I doubt anybody is, most of our practice is off the cushion. And I agree that this is something to take on with great curiosity and sincerity and with clear intentionality. I think a lot happens and a lot can deepen through staying with a quite specific intention for a period of time. You know, like even in these first two verses, to really begin to discern quite consciously, when is there happiness and peace? When is there distress? Aha, what is making the difference? What is making the difference? Is there a choice involved in that? What is being practiced in those moments? So to stay with that for a little bit of time, and just to see how that lands with us, and as something, as you say, on the freeway, you know, in the car, in the supermarket, with our families, you know, with strangers, at work, you know, what are we practicing? Because we're always practicing something, consciously or unconsciously, you know, intentionally or unintentionally. And the moment that we can move a little bit more into skillful intentionality in a more sustained way, I think we begin to see the difference.
My question is it led by mind, as in mind or manas or chitta? How is the original text?
I mean, personally, I don't find it helpful to make that distinction. You know, and I think in Buddhist psychology, you know, that these two heart-mind, you know, heart/mind, mind/heart, I think is for me a more helpful way to see. The original text, I believe, is Chitta, but I'd have to go back to the Pali.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, should we move on a little bit before we have a break? I mean, for me, these first two verses in the Dhammapada are so pivotal in the Buddhist teaching of freedom. Because what he's really saying is that life and experience is not predetermined. Distress is not a life sentence. Struggle is not a life sentence. Distress and happiness are also not just accidental. And I think reflecting on our own life experience, it very much raises the question of choice. There are many conditions in our lives, as we've mentioned, that we have no choice of. You know, aging, sickness, death, difficult people, the pandemic. None of us had any choices over this. But where do our choices actually lie but in our responses? And what is it that enables us to respond to the world of conditions skillfully, enabling us to make wise choices and find greater peace and happiness? I think this is a question we bring to our outer lives and our inner world. You know, I think some of you will be familiar with the quote from Viktor Frankl, you know, Holocaust survivor, when he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our power to choose. And in our power to choose lies our growth and our freedom. In our lives, that there may again be things to cultivate and things to let go of. These are choices. Simplicity and calm, rather than overstimulation. And busyness. Time with good and wise friends. These are choices that we can cultivate. Whatever we feed, be it wholesome or unwholesome, will grow and will mature. What is the taste of being locked into patterns of ill will and fear and greed and agitation? Not just that it leads to suffering, its very nature is suffering. And what is the taste of generosity and kindness and compassion, of courage and joyfulness and mindfulness? Not just that it leads to peace and happiness, but this is the peace and happiness we can begin to taste here and now. This is not easy. It's not easy. But beginning to have those moments where we can pause and have enough mindfulness, enough stillness of being, born of a well-collected heart, those choices do become more accessible to us. Antonia.
Yeah, I think that's fine, Christina. I'll comment on the next verse.
Okay, well, I was going to then, actually, yeah, this might be a good time to just take a 5-minute stretch. Please don't go far because we have a lot we want to cover tonight. It's a response to the earlier question of what the Pali word is in the early text of the Dhammapada for mind. The term that is used is manomaya. Manomaya. I don't know if you can put that in the chat on text, Marianne. M-A-N-O-M-A-Y-O. Thank you. So to continue with the next verses. Verse 3, he abused me, attacked me, defeated me, robbed me. For those carrying on like this, hatred does not end. She abused me, attacked me, defeated me, robbed me. For those not carrying on like this, hatred ends. Hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hate alone does it end. This is an ancient truth. Many do not realize that here we must die. For those who realize this, quarrels end. I think that the Buddha was very clear in teaching this most significant and abiding teaching, that hatred and ill will simply feeds more hatred and ill will. And how much courage it takes to step out of this cycle. There's a quote from one of the early Greek philosophers. He says that holding on to hatred is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemy to die. We know the power of hatred and ill will in body, speech, and mind. I know hatred's a very big word, a very strong word. But when we think of the ill will and the spectrum word that it is of impatience and judgment and shame and blame and irritation and annoyance and jealousy, resentment, it's such a huge spectrum. And we know the effect of this in our body, speech, and mind, to alienate and to divide and to harm. What is non-hatred? It's not something that is passive, and it's certainly not the sacrifice of wise discernment. It certainly doesn't mean that we consent to the harmful. Non-hatred, it's actually hard to find just one word in the English for this Pali word, avera. Love doesn't really do it justice, because non-hatred is also a spectrum phrase that includes patience, kindness, courage, equanimity, compassion. What is it like for us in the very real situations in our lives when we meet hatred and ill will? What happens in our minds? What happens in our hearts? Is it possible for us in those moments to stand on the ground of understanding, compassion, and equanimity, clearly to say no to the unacceptable and to commit ourselves to healing, rather than entering the gates of hatred ourselves? There's a wonderful quote I love from the Tibetan tradition, where Patrul Rinpoche in his book, he says, unruly beings are uncountable. To remove this thorn of ill will from our heart is to vanquish all of our enemies. Antonia, would you like to add to this?
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, these verses are verses that I've been really reflecting on a lot. And I think that, for me, what it really brings forth is the reminder that all of us probably, we have been suffering in different ways. And some of us, we have been experiencing different traumatic events and so forth. So there's something there's something about the reality of the suffering that we may have experienced, that we may be experiencing. And then it's not saying that, it's experiencing this, but it's saying carrying on like this. So it really brings forth the kind of continued suffering that can happen, not just due to what we may have experienced, but the continued suffering when we keep carrying in a specific way. So it's really an invitation to reflect on what does true healing mean, and what is healing in our lives. And we're reminded that hatred doesn't end by hatred, but by non-hatred. So it's really looking into the kind of suffering that we are carrying when we are holding on to hatred, when we are holding on to ill will, that no matter what has happened, that we are still suffering as long as we are holding on to this, and really looking to what can support us in and we talked about before how perception is really important here. And the ancient truth of it, it also really brings to mind this, how often it can, again, just repeating that, things do happen to us. We do experience things, and things do happen in the world, but also how we can sometimes hold on to it, and how that kind of suffering can just continue and continue and continue, and see what does it really take to have a mind that is peaceful. What does it really take to change the shape of our mind, and change the perception about maybe how things sometimes become very unnuanced, but the kind of respect for the nuances and the potential for healing when we don't give up and say that this is the only way I can see this is the way it is, but we can stay open, and we can stay curious, and we can continue to investigate and continue to see what is the part that's really freeing the heart, and what is the part that's really freeing the mind. Mm. Yeah. Christina.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. Many do not realize that we here must die. For those who realize this, quarrels end. I think this is actually so profound. It's about living in the light of impermanence and uncertainty, living in the light of our own death. And the manner of our dying may very well resemble the manner of our living. When life is so fleeting and precious, I think we deeply see that we cannot afford ill will and hatred. When we know that our worlds can crumble in a moment, and our lives can so unexpectedly change or even end in a moment, then I feel it lends a certain urgency to peacemaking. It doesn't mean, again, bowing to the unacceptable. It doesn't mean that we have to love the difficult people in our lives. But maybe we can put down the burdens of resentment and blame and judgment. Maybe we could consider, this is something I proposed to myself some years ago as an invitation, what would it be like to die without having any enemies? And I don't mean enemies, people, mortal enemies. But what would it be like to die without resentments or sense of needing to blame or shame anyone in this world? Antonia, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just really that this about impermanence and is just so important. And I have one of my teachers, this is 90% of what he's teaching, and he used to say that this is really like an instruction that's pointing out the most important to us if we really take this to heart. And in the Tibetan tradition, there is this way of practicing where you also use reflections, and where you, at the beginning, every morning, before you do your other practice, you sit down and you reflect on your life, really. And these reflections are meant to turn the mind towards the path, turn the mind towards practice. And one of these reflections is about impermanence. So really, reflecting on impermanence and taking it to heart really brings this urgency to our practice. It really stops us from postponing, and it really brings the urgency to our practice. It's really something that motivates us to practice. So it's in a way, it's really beautiful. And there's also a kind of sadness that can come, which is a positive sadness. But we also, when we reflect on impermanence, and we also, see how much time that can just go with things that are not the most important. And it really puts it into perspective. And this about giving up quarrels, it really brings home to us what is the most important, and it makes it more easy to give up on some of the things that are not so important, but may at times when we are not in touch with it, can seem quite important. So it brings us back into perspective.
Quite some years ago, maybe about 12 years ago, I unexpectedly found myself in a very difficult sort of conflicted situation with someone who'd previously been a colleague. And I felt quite injured, actually, in truth. I felt quite injured by the whole situation. And then it was never resolved. We didn't actually see each other for another 10, 11 years. And then quite out of the blue, some weeks ago, I received a letter of apology, where the person said, they were so aggressive because they felt quite afraid. And I received this letter of apology, and I was absolutely startled, actually, to register my response wasn't immediately great, forgiveness all round, My response was, this is not quite a good enough apology. I'd like a little bit more apology than that. I'd really like to hear you grovel a little bit, And I caught that little bit of meanness in myself that wasn't quite ready to sort of just release this. And then I thought, well, I'm the one who's paying the price for that little bit of meanness, not that other person. And it felt like it was very, very telling for me to really realize I can just, it's not that it's been on my mind for 10 years, but I could just put this down. I just could put this quarrel down, and let it be done, and be gracious, and be accepting, and be kind. To be kind. And how often those choices can be there can be something about, almost being attached to a certain level of ill will because it makes us feel right, or it makes us feel superior, or it makes us feel justified, So I'll just hold on to this little bit of ill will. The other person's merrily getting on with their life, while we're still kind of doing that sort of clenching. And to feel, it doesn't mean that everything is forgotten or everything is resolved, but maybe we don't need to live in that space. The next section of this, the next verses in this section really kind of changed tone a little bit. Verses 7 and 8. Whoever lives focused on the pleasant, senses unguarded, immoderate with food, lazy and sluggish, will be overpowered by Mara, as a weak tree is bent in the wind. Whoever lives focused on the unpleasant, senses guarded, moderate with food, faithful and diligent, will not be overpowered by Mara, as a stone mountain is unmoved by the wind. We are all aware, that there's a kind of, I think, collective encouragement to make a mission out of maximizing pleasant sensation and minimizing unpleasant. In many ways, it could even be regarded as success. But what happens when our minds are inclined in this way, moment to moment? More pleasant sounds, more pleasant sights, more pleasant sensations, more pleasant situations. It makes us a hostage to the world of conditions. And more importantly, it externalizes the source of happiness and unhappiness. Believing that if certain conditions are in place, I will be happy. And if other conditions are in place, I will be unhappy. And pursuing that mission to maximize the pleasant sensation, I think, can make us somewhat beggars at the sense doors. More, more, more. And we find ourselves overwhelmed by Mara, overwhelmed by craving, overwhelmed by agitation, overwhelmed by ill will. This is not a suggestion to pursue the unpleasant. There's quite enough of the unpleasant that comes our way in this life uninvited. But do we give the same attention to the unpleasant as we do to the pleasant? Or is our more immediate response to fix it, to make the unpleasant go away, to get rid of it, to avoid it? Perhaps if we can give an equality of attention to the pleasant and the unpleasant in our lives, we can develop some equanimity, being equally near all things, not hostage to the world of conditions, still touched deeply, but not overwhelmed by Mara, like a mountain unmoved by the wind. I think sometimes these verses can also be seen to relate to what are called the 8 worldly winds that are part of all of our lives. Praise and blame, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, success and failure. How easily we gravitate to one and fear the other. We also see that this mission to pursue the pleasant and avoid the unpleasant is actually a mission to secure a sense of self that we feel is acceptable to us. Antonia.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. That was beautiful. I don't have so much to add, but just one reflection that really relates to what you're speaking about also. And that is this with, our own assumptions about our own mind and how important that is, and how these assumptions about where happiness is to be found, how these assumptions, if we are not really clear about what kind of assumptions we are holding, and if we're not really clear about understanding our own mind and the power of our own mind, then it's just our habits that's going to run us, and then it's very likely that we will end up with what you're really describing. So I also see how these verses are building on what we've already talked about, understanding the mind and understanding the creative power of the mind.
Yeah. And it goes on, verses 9 and 10. Whoever is defiled and devoid of self-control and truthfulness, yet wears the saffron robe, is unworthy of the saffron robe. Whoever has purged the defilements is self-controlled and truthful, and well established in virtue, is worthy of the saffron robe. this phrase self-control in other translations, which I must admit I feel a little bit more resonance with, is about restraint rather than self-control. It's about restraint. What kind of restraint do we exercise in our lives around impulse, around how we use our sense doors, around speech? You know, how much restraint do we actually cultivate in our lives? How much do we actually cultivate that space between stimulus and response? It's good to remember that in the time of the Buddha, the saffron robe wasn't necessarily just a Buddhist thing. The saffron robe was worn as a mark of identity for one who has left the world. One, in doing that, in theory, is holy or saintly or renunciate. Yet, as the Buddha remarked, much can go on behind the robes. Just as we can, you know, we can look really good when we sit, can't we? You know, we can look really good in walking meditation. You know, we can look tremendously sort of dedicated and mindful, and inwardly we know that we can be so lost in hindrances or rumination or seething with ill will. And I think what the Buddha is pointing out here, that it's really not just about how we look or what we feel, but about what is present in our hearts. In another discourse, the Buddha puts it, it's not just a robe that makes a nun or a monk, but their ethics, their good-heartedness, and their understanding. You'd like to add to that?
No, I think that was great. Thank you.
Section 11, I delight in. Those who consider the inessential to be essential and see the essential as inessential don't reach the essential, living in the field of wrong intention. I love this so much because it's often the first instruction I give when I teach in a retreat. You know, it's a real encouragement to people to reflect as you go into this retreat time, to really reflect on what is essential in this time and what is inessential. And maybe we can learn a little bit more to put down the inessential. And I think when we look at the sort of movement and activities of our minds and bodies every single day, there's often so much that's inessential, isn't it? Rumination, rehearsal, judgment, blame, busyness, obsession, comparing. There's so much that's inessential. Inessential in the sense that it doesn't help us to thrive. It doesn't help us to grow. It doesn't help us to live more fully or more wholeheartedly. And I think there is much that's really essential. Mindfulness, compassion, love, sensitivity, kindness, joyfulness, space, rest, easefulness. There is so much that is essential if we are to thrive. And personally, I think it's so helpful for us to begin to discern the difference between what is essential and what is inessential, because this gives us so many pointers about what to cultivate and what really to begin to be willing to put down and to let go of. It speaks of how the inessential can guide us into a world of impulse and habit, and how the essential guides us into a world of wakefulness. When the Buddha speaks about right intention, those who know the essential to be essential and the inessential is inessential reach the essential. It's really speaking about liberation here, living in the field of right intention. And in the Buddha's teaching of right intention, it's really a short list. You know? the intentions of kindness, friendliness, the intention of compassion, and the intention of non-clinging. That these are the right intentions, or the wise intentions that guide us to liberation. When we went into our various lockdowns, for me, one of the great revelations was to realize how much was really inessential. You know, how much time in life had been given to, you know, getting the right loaf of bread, you know, or, you know, the right kind of juice, or, you know, the right people to be with. And suddenly, you know, whatever happened was fine, you know, it was fine. Oh, no flower today. Oh, that's fine. You know, really beginning to reclaim that sense of not being so governed by having to have things the way that I think they should be. Antonia.
Yeah. So I think, you know, this is really also something that when we have these moments of more clarity, where we very much intuit this, and I think that this is what often brings us to practice, is actually this realization or this sense that what we are pursuing is really not the most essential, and it's like chewing that bone, and it doesn't really have the power and the juice that we're expecting, and at some point it's not so satisfying, and we really begin to seek something else. So I think that for me at least, and I think for many others, this is something that really rings true for us, and this is what also brings us to practice. This is what really makes us be giving up other things and giving up to renounce with a sense of joy, because there is a sense of what is more essential, and where something that is more genuine can be found.
Thank you. I think that this last section of this first, I mean, these last verses of this first section, I really think here the Buddha is really actually pointing us towards, again, what is essential. What is essential for waking up? What is essential for awakening? And in these last verses, he really speaks to both ethical foundations and the essential nature, or the supportive nature, of a well-cultivated mind and heart. As rain penetrates an ill-thatched house, so lust penetrates an uncultivated mind. As rain doesn't penetrate a well-thatched house, so lust does not penetrate a well-cultivated mind. One who does evil grieves in this life, grieves in the next, grieves in both worlds. Seeing one's own defiled acts brings grief and affliction. One who makes merit is basically one who acts skillfully, rejoices in this life, rejoices in the next, rejoices in both worlds. Seeing one's own pure acts brings joy and delight. One who does evil is tormented in this life and the next and in both worlds, knowing I've done evil. Reborn in realms of woe, he's tormented all the more. The one who is skillful, who does good in this life, is delighted. She's delighted knowing I have acted in goodness. She delights all the more. One who recites many teachings but being negligent, doesn't act accordingly, is like a cowherd counting others' cows and doesn't attain the benefits of this contemplative life. One who recites but a few teachings, yet lives according to the Dharma, abandoning passion, ill will, and delusion, aware and with mind well freed, not clinging in this life or the next, attains the benefits of the contemplative life. And then this is quite powerful in terms of, ways, the foundations of a well-cultivated mind, the ethical foundations, and what it means. I mean, the Buddha speaks to so often, and I think this was quite unique in his time, emphasis that the Buddha gave to integrity and to ethics as being the foundation of awakening. Because this is what frees, as he says, the mind of regret and remorse and guilt and shame and agitation. He says, I know of no one thing that does so much harm as an untrained mind. And once understood, there is no one thing that is a greater friend than a well-trained mind. Ethics is what allows the mind to calm and to still. U Pandita is one of the more fierce Burmese teachers. He once said that, how can you expect to deepen in meditation without ethics? Because all you're doing is cultivating the conditions for unpleasant states of mind to arise. I think it's true. Established in integrity with the collective mind, not clinging to anything, these are the ingredients of peace and of freedom. Antonia, is there anything you want to speak to this?
No, just that this is really, before there was this question about daily life. And again, I feel that these verses are really verses that we take with us into our daily life. And we just tirelessly really look at the difference in our life, the difference when we act with integrity and the difference when we don't. And it's very, very easy again to see the kind of price that we're paying, the kind of price that we're paying, not being at ease, our minds not being at ease, not feeling good about ourselves, trying to suppress, not remember, and so forth. And it really brings home how this is something that it's not morality, but that it's really about, we see it and it has the effect on our life. And out of that clear seeing and out of that caring for ourselves comes also the caring for others. These verses, to really bring them into daily life and just to let them stay close with us there.
I realize that we're running out of time. So we'll probably return to the section on vigilance in another session, because I do want to take this a little bit of a pause moment as we near the end of our time, to see if anyone has any reflections or questions that they'd like to bring forward.
You described a peaceful mind as a state where we cease to argue with the realities of change and where we live in harmony with how things are. I personally struggle with that. We live in a world of immense cruelty and injustice, and when one speaks of being okay with how things are, one struggles to see where the room for action is. Even if you recognize the need to not fight what is, where is the room for action against so many injustices? I would love to hear your response to that.
Thank you for raising that. It's a really important point. I mean, I think it's very easy for us to overlook the fact that the Buddha was an activist. He was deeply concerned with social change, social justice, with uprooting many of the causes that led people to be, stuck and kind of almost sentenced to certain ways of certain lives because of how they were born or who they, whatever class they were born into. The phrase living in harmony with the way things are needs to be used in a very specific way, is that we're no longer arguing with the reality of change and dukkha and non-self. So it's not living in harmony with the unacceptable. It's living in harmony with the anicca, dukkha, anatta. So we're not doing that argument, this shouldn't be happening to me, this is not fair, why, all of that, I should live forever, all of that kind of mind stuff. Apart outside of that, there's no suggestion, I think, in the teaching of bowing to the unacceptable. It is recognizing that there is much that is unacceptable in our world, in that it leads to the furthering of dukkha and distress and cruelty. And, if we look at the teachings of compassion, it is not just the heart that trembles in the face of suffering, it's also the warrior that is committed to uprooting the causes of suffering. And I think we need to be able to hold both of those teachings together and simultaneously. Otherwise, we could too easily have a prescription for passivity. Antonia, sorry, I jumped in there.
No, I think that's good. That's good.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our evening. I do thank you very much for coming, for your questions, your reflections. I hope to see you again next week. And just a moment for everyone to unmute and say goodbye.